Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of My Dog Will Eat My Face. I come to you on this day with some sad updates. To be quite blunt, I'll get that right out of the gates immediately. There was quite recently as just golly, a few days ago, as of the time of this recording, certain events that transpired within my life that visited upon me a certain level of fear that I do not think I've so much had before, which would be an amazing feat for sure. I've gone through many fearful events, but yet here we are. I don't think I have yet faced the abyss of one of my biggest fears. And it's something that was somewhat introduced, as I said, in recent days, especially through hindsight of some certain events and my discussion about those events with my counselor. So, with all that being said, I am going to summarize what exactly happened and what it might mean for now and for the long term. And I'm sure you're now itching to know what happened. And it's one of those things where, once again, we're not entirely sure what precisely happened. But I had a relatively minor, admittedly, episode where my cognition was severely damaged, or at least it was on the fritz for the time being, shall we say. And my ability to even control my level of consciousness was essentially robbed from me. And no, it wasn't an alien abduction, and I wasn't kidnapped by deranged, leather faced Texans. I don't know. I love Texas. No offense to Texans. I'm just going back to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Anyway, nothing like that happened. And we are left with only a guess as to medically what transpired. So, without further ado, I'll go ahead and explain what exactly happened in very recent days. Again, as of the date of this recording, anyway. So, my friends, what happened, albeit still kind of nebulous, I wanted to comment on it quickly as it was still fresh on my mind. But basically, all what it was I seemed to take some sort of bypass again to Crazy Town, if you want to call it that. As some of you may know, maybe some of you don't know, I had one of the worst episodes of my life. Not this last July, but the one before that in the prior year, where I essentially became completely disassociated from reality. And I have absolutely no memory of 2 or 3 weeks that had occurred in my life where it's completely blacked out, not just hazy, not just I can't remember really. No. As far as my brain can tell me, these weeks never existed. That is, it's just a null value. It's not a confusing value. It just doesn't exist. And one of my very first memories was coming to, so to speak, in a local nursing home. And there were some other things that kind of went down from there, but I've already talked about it. You could look it up in my podcast history. I believe it's called My Trip to Crazy Town. And from that podcast, most certainly you could learn about what had previously happened. So I had yet another strange cognitive event happen that paints a rather ugly future for myself shortly around the corner if it persists. What happened is something that began on an otherwise very normal day for me. I was going through all my usual motions and talking to people and making phone calls and paying bills, when I decided to splurge a little bit and get myself a really nice uh, lunner, as I call it. It's kind of like my mix of lunch and dinner. It's my big meal of the day. So what I decided to do is I ordered delivered uh, lemon seared grilled chicken with a Dijon mustard glaze on top with mashed potatoes and asparagus. And then also on top of that, ordered a side entree of mixed sauteed wild mushrooms. And I guess to top it all off, I also ordered another entree of of a lobster tail macaroni and cheese. And that's still in my fridge. I took a few bites of it to try it while it was fresh, and it was delicious, as I'm sure you could imagine. But I decided to save that for later, and it's still sitting in my fridge now. I'll probably eat that tonight. I'll imbibe in that uh, meal probably as soon as I'm done making this podcast. Anyway, it was incredibly delicious. Now, recently my appetite had been rather lackluster, to say it mildly. I've been eating basically less and less. And I've also recently have begun to lose actual biomass. That is, I'm not just losing perhaps edemic fluid, which is something I want to lose, but I'm instead now also losing uh, muscle tissue and body mass, essentially. I'm shrinking. There you go. There's the short version. And my appetites have thus been lackluster, and I've not been eating as much as I once had. Before all these events, before my migration into hospice, before the drastic change in how my health was projected. I'm sure I've said it before many times, but I'll say it again. I was a rather dedicated foodie. Me and my friends, and also me and my ex, would love to go out to try new restaurants, new foods, different fusions of foods. And honestly, at least certainly between me and my ex, there was no level of decadence that was too much for us to abide. We even flew all the way to New York City to do some other things, but we try to get into, at the time, Marimoto's restaurant in downtown there, or near down. Was it in? No, well, it was more like in the village, Marimoto's uh, restaurant in New York. And he's better known as being, at the time, the Iron Chef. Do you remember the Iron Chef show with Marimoto? And he would open his own five-star restaurants. But anyway, long story short, his restaurant that we patroned was reported to be the only restaurant in these United States to serve fugu. And we really wanted to try fugu. If you don't know what fugu is, let me explain. It is a very, uh, golly, what do I want to call it? Embellished delicacy originating from Japan. And what it is essentially a nigiri or a sashimi serving of what the English speaking world calls puffer fish. And that, I guess, to the layperson doesn't sound that exciting. It just sounds like just another form of sushi. But let me tell you a bit about puffer fish. They're very odd looking creatures, and they can blow themselves up to look bigger than they actually are. And their bodies are covered with these sort of spikes to scare off any potential predators that might see them as a delicious meal. But in addition to that defense, the pufferfish had the ability to secrete poison into its predator. And this poison can be found in any pufferfish you pull out of the sea. And if it were to be ingested by a human being, it would pretty much just mean certain death. It is a very toxic poison that they can emit. And when you get the pufferfish nigiri style, you've got to be someone who is very skilled with how they cut the fish so as to leave enough of the toxin in the fish, or they call it fugu. So again, I'm just going to say fugu instead of puffer fish from now on. There, just laying that out. So they leave enough of the toxin in the fugu to where it can generate what I've read and been told is a sort of euphoric uh, high state, and also a very unique tingling sensation on the tongue. But you've got to be able to serve that raw, mind you. We're talking sashimi or nigiri here. Got to be able to serve that raw to a customer and willingly give them the right amount of the fugu toxin so they can experience that low dose pleasure and not exceed it by any iota. For doing so would most certainly cause your imminent death. There is no turning back. There is no anti venom. At least last I heard. God, for all I know, they did come up with an anti venom like 5 years ago, and I'm way behind. But at the time, if you were to eat too much of the fugu or the fugu's toxicity, it was lights out for you. So, anyway, me and my ex flew to New York City to Marimoto's just to get a chance to try fugu. But when we got there, the state and the city of New York stopped them and said, no, you can't do it. So now I think you have to go to Osaka to even try it. Now, anyway, why do I bring up that little story? You see, I thoroughly enjoyed eating new and unusual foods. And lots of it. I was a card carrying foodie. That's why I share that story. I was willing to die for the ultimate foodie experience. And so food has always been, and it's still to this day to me, something that I really enjoy. I it it's something that is a top layer pleasure for me, and always has been. But lately, like I said, my appetite's been shrinking, and frankly, being isolated to my apartment for so many years, I just don't have that experience that much anymore. So when I got this entree recently of the completely safe, mind you, but quite delicious lemon chicken with Dijon glaze and sauteed wild mushrooms and asparagus and mashed potatoes and lobster, macaroni and cheese. I ate everything in one sitting because it was so delicious, except for all of the mac and cheese. And I did that intentionally. I had a few bites just to get it while it's fresh. But my goal was and is to have that as a leftover probably tonight. So I ate this enormous meal at home and I loved it. And then something happened. Something very nefarious resulted from this rare, at this point, indulgence. Oh, one more note before I continue on with respect to fugu. There is an episode of The Simpsons that gets into this where a master sushi chef who was the only one skilled enough to serve fugu was busy with his girl in the back seat of a car while Homer ordered the fugu and they try to talk him out of it. And he was adamant. And Homer yelled, "Fugu me!" So you can find that episode. Long story short, the skilled chef comes in and realizes that this more subpar chef that took his place while he was out gallivanting, let's say, that this other chef had cut the fugu incorrectly and served Homer too much of the fugu poison. And so when they found that out, they told they told Homer, they told Fugu. I'll just cut that out later. They told Homer not to worry. On the back of each menu is mapped to nearest hospital. Anyway, there's a whole Simpsons episode on Fugu. If you're ever bored, go look that up. It's funny. And you'll see I'm telling the truth about Fugu. And I almost went that far. I wanted to. I went to New York City to do it and came back and looked at my ex in the eyes and said, "It looks like we gotta go to Osaka, babe, to get that fugu now." Anyways, that was a big diversion. I only use that, as I said already, as an example of my appreciation and love of the finer and, yeah, sometimes odder, stranger foods in the world. I've traveled the world, so eating weird things is something that I've been doing since I was about 15 years old. So it's a big part of my life. And for me to indulge in this really yummy meal, it was really expensive. I'm not even going to tell you what I spent on this. I got it delivered, and I was kind of celebrating something else in my life, uh, which isn't really important. But I wanted to treat myself to a nice meal. Nothing wrong with that. Apparently, there's a lot wrong with that now. I've mentioned already how, as my heart has weakened, weekend. God, I can't enunciate that. Weekend versus weekend. God, they sound the same. I need to take enunciation classes or something. Anyway, moving on. That Where was I going with that? Oh, yes, where I was going was my heart has become weaker and weaker to where it's unable to pump important nutrients and even oxygen to important parts and even organs inside my body. And this has been ongoing and it's been resulting in various manifestations that some might be minor, others are extraordinarily embarrassing, literally, and others are just a nuisance. But the scary part of this, and I've known this for a little while now, is that one by one, my organs are going to start getting less and less of what they need to stay alive. And my friends, on that day when I ate that wonderful meal for lunch, it was like 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 1:30 or something like that. Excuse me. About a half hour after, things started to happen to me. I suddenly became extraordinarily fatigued, tired, and now, before, when I was more healthier in life, when if I ate a big meal, I would call this a food coma. I had it all the time. See, to me, I'm just going to be blunt. I never thought of the notion that some people out there stop eating when they're full. My MO has been to take the eating as far as I can until I'm hunched over, sweating things out, unable to feel my feet, pressing my hands against anything to hold me up, or gasping for air and saying, "Oh my God, Oh my God. Oh my God. When I would have a good meal, that's where my desired destination would be. And I know that sounds terrible. And yes, it's a very unhealthy way. I don't advocate that to anyone to make that to be a way of them eating their food. Gosh, maybe I could even legally have a eating disorder from that. I'm not even going to think about that. Anyway, so I've had long experience with big meals. And strangely, my dear listeners, I've always been kind of a skinny guy. I'm not even kidding. Um, the biggest exception was when I started to come down with terrible edema and water retention when I gained a lot of weight. And that was only very recently because of my heart condition, my congestive heart failure. But other than that, throughout my life, I was always thin. Didn't matter how much I ate, what I ate, how disgusting I took my meals to, or how far I took them. And I'd overeat, and be miserable for days sometimes. Because you know what they say the bad thing is? Here's another fun foodie phrase. I'm going to share it really quick. Do you know what the bad thing is they say about German food? Give up? The problem with German food is you're hungry again in 3 days. Ha, ha, ha. I hope some of you got that joke and the reference. If you didn't, don't worry about it. Um, we're just going to move on and pretend that didn't happen. Anyway, I was very happy at the time to indulge in this meal that I fully thought was a sort of treat to myself for doing and accomplishing something that I'm not going to get into here. It's personal stuff. It's nothing gross or weird or stupid. It's just something else in my life that I was trying to get done, and I did it. And so I wanted to treat myself to a little something. So yeah, about half an hour afterwards, I started to get not just the typical food coma that I heretofore have described, but I don't know what you want to call it. If you want to say I was falling asleep, sure, but maybe, but it was more akin to passing out. I was constantly passing out, no matter what I was doing. It wasn't like I laid back on the couch, my eyes were tired, and I took a nap. No. I was very full and at the time happy with everything I ate. But suddenly, I kept losing consciousness. And the thing that would jar me awake and startle me to be conscious again is me dropping whatever I'm doing. Like, I would be on the phone, I was chatting with people, and the next thing I know, I hear a loud clanking noise, and it's because I just passed out and dropped my cell phone because I lost consciousness. And it kept happening. This was not a one-time thing. It was like every 30 seconds. I'm not exaggerating. And so I try to text it friends and to some family, to my sister-in-law, that there was something really wrong here. And when I try to type to them, I would make as many as 5 to 7 attempts to make the text remotely coherent. And I utterly failed most of the time. In fact, my sister-in-law, who I just mentioned, asked me, "Oh my God, are you okay?" And I did manage to reply a simple no. And you can imagine how she felt and others felt when I was just typing the worst gibberish to everyone. And it was just the weirdest thing. I knew what I wanted to say, but it was like I couldn't connect the thought, the cognition, to the appropriate operation of either my lips or texting with my fingers. Like, I would try texting with my fingers, and I felt like I was cross-eyed. And I would every once in a while just depress on one key. And so it would be like 14 M's and then another word. And that was like my fifth iteration of making an attempt to say something. Because, like, what the heck is that? And so I backspaced and try to correct it. But finally, I would just give up and sign and be like, I hope you can understand this. And a lot of times they didn't. Except they did all say, go lay down. So, what I did was just that. I went ahead and laid down in my bedroom, but when I got to my bed, I went ahead and I called my hospice company because they are now basically my 911. When you go into hospice care, hospice itself, who's there 24/7, or they're supposed to be, is your new 911. Don't call 911 if it's related in any way to why you're in hospice. Now, of course, if I like break my leg in a car accident or something crazy, I'm still calling 911. That has nothing to do with heart failure. It's a broken limb. Things like that are okay. But for anything else that's even remotely related to your primary illness, you call hospice, not 911. So, anyway, that's who I called right before I went down again on the bed. And so I called my hospice. I told them what was happening, and I managed to communicate it to them. And they said they're sending somebody out right now. It might take a little while, but we are going to send an emergency nurse out. Well, my regular nurse, who I normally see, was out of town. She's out of town this whole week. So, and I already knew that, so that's not a big deal. Don't get me wrong. Uh, but so they had to send some emergency nurse to me, and I said, okay, well, I'm going to put my phone on my nightstand. I'm not going to turn off the volume. So just have them call me when they're on their way, and then I'll make sure they get through security here. We connect. Easy enough. Next thing I know, I'm awakened in bed to a woman's voice coming from the other side of my apartment calling my name. And my dog was with me, of course, and he was freaking out. I was freaking out. And it was the emergency nurse, and apparently they couldn't get a hold of me. But my cell phone was just, 4 inches from my head. And then I noticed that apparently when I was sleeping, somehow I knocked my cell phone off the nightstand into the floor. And I don't know if it hit like the volume button or mute button or something weird, but I had like, golly, 14 missed calls or something absurd like that, and an equal number of missed texts of my hospice desperately trying to get a hold of me. So now they're freaking out. And that was just a, Keystone Comedy of Errors thing. I accidentally knocked the phone off the nightstand and it landed on something that turned the volume off or down, and so I just didn't hear it. But unfortunately, that meant that they had to get access from my landlord to the apartment. So then the landlord was freaking out. And they were all really scared. The nurses at my hospice, they totally told me they were scared. They thought that when they went in, I might have finally kicked the bucket, frankly. Um, the reality, though, was the 2.5 hours of that sleep helped a lot. I was coherent again. I was able to text again. There were still some weird typos that happened, but I could erase them and correct them now. And I was still a little woozy and all that, but I was no longer passing out and dropping whatever it is I'm holding or doing. Like I'm just passing out on the spot. So that got better. But now we come to this point of what the heck just happened. We were all very confused because this seemed to come out of nowhere and seemed to be another weird episode. But I did sit down, obviously, and talk to the nurse who did arrive. And she had a theory. And I agreed that it was a very good theory with respect to what happened to me just the other day. So, what happened? Essentially, the short version is that in the same vein of difficulties that I've already described in this podcast, in summary, and in others, to where my heart is weakening more and more, and my organs are basically suffering more and more from their ability to get appropriate blood flow and nutrients. And this was essentially another instance of that same problem. And what happened was I ate an unusually large meal. Not for me, let's say 10 years ago or something. I could eat like a tank, it didn't matter. But as I said, for years now, my appetite's been a lot more diminished. So I shoved this enormous meal into my stomach, and my heart started to pump blood to my GI to process that food. This is that food coma that I had so many times for so many years, where I would just feel super tired and want to take a nap. But I was never incoherent or passing out or anything like that, obviously. But this was basically just another symptom of poor heart function and worsening heart function in comparison to where when it sent so much blood to the GI to manage this large meal, it did so at the expense of my heart and my brain. And while there's some comfort, certainly, in maybe having a solid theory as to why this happened. And I should add, we also checked it by the doctors at the hospice facility, if that made sense to them. Because again, this was my nurse's theory, not my doctor's. But um, I found out on the day of this recording that my doctor agreed completely. That's exactly what likely happened. Is that it was a large meal and my heart could not handle it. It couldn't keep my GI and my brain happy at the same time. It was too weak. It it is too weak, I should say. Was and is. And so you could say, great, easy solution. Don't eat such big meals anymore. Eat smaller meals. Fine. Super. I get it. I can probably do that. Well, I know I can, not probably. I know I could do that, especially with this information. It's completely, though, the antithesis of my old MO of eating a good meal, where food for me was in the number one spot as a source of enjoyment for me. Another example to that point that just popped in my mind. When I was working last, uh, I was working in a law department for a major corporation. And there were some periods of time where I would have to travel around the country about every other week to cities I've heard of and to many others I've never heard of before. I didn't know their name when I was there, and I still couldn't tell you their name because I was given basically a case to handle to go there, show up to court at 8 or 8:30 in the morning, argue my company's case, and then as soon as I was done with that, I went straight back to the airport and back home and got out of there. But doing that, I was pretty much assured at least one night, I should say, in this other place. Now, if I'm in some podunk town, I don't do a lot. But sometimes it was in really nice places. Atlanta was a recent one. Washington, D.C. was another recent one. Not lately, but before I went on this journey of chaos. Uh, New York City, many other places, Chicago, and major metropolitan areas. So one of the things I would do as a foodie is I would find a really good restaurant in that city that I would like to try, perhaps one I've never been to before. And I had no qualms whatsoever of going there and eating there by myself. And a lot of people get kind of weird and freaked out. Maybe, it weirds them out or they feel uncomfortable eating by themselves in a fancy restaurant. You know, maybe they'll take out a little notepad and make notes in it in a bit, just once in a while to convince everyone else you're just a food critic. I didn't do that. I didn't care because I was there to treat myself to this food as a reward for putting up with that kind of flight schedule. And honestly, I didn't even expense uh, those meals to my business because one, they wouldn't pay them. They're like, why did you spend $110 at this restaurant? Well, they had an oyster special. Yeah, no, I'm not gonna, do that because I did it for myself. I enjoyed food that much. I could sit there in the restaurant on my own and enjoy the food and experience it for whatever worth it is. With others or completely by myself, as I often had to. I was in some city. I didn't know anyone. I mean, yeah, I could stay in the hotel and try to get room service, but if it was a major metropolitan city, I would try to up it and get the good food. So that's just another example of how much food's been of value to me in my life. Now, when you couple this with what I said in my last podcast, it's it's seemingly another I'm trying to think of the word. It's another enjoyment of mine that I have now been robbed of because my heart is unable to handle doing that and keeping the brain happy at the same time. So, sure, I could eat the same thing in small controlled meals. Yeah, and I'm sure I will, and I'll still enjoy a lot of food. But again, that wasn't my MO. I loved pigging out. And so it's really just one more thing I've always enjoyed to where I either can't do it or have to alter the way in which I do it. The latter isn't too catastrophic, obviously, but it still feels like yet another grab at something dear to me that I enjoy in life. And as time goes on, I am less convinced it is worth the adaptation with so many losses, so to speak, or perceived losses, I should say. Obviously, I still did eat all those meals. I didn't throw them all up the moment I entered hospice. All those wonderful events happened. Nothing was taken away from me. But it's just one more thing that is further away from me from being able to enjoy my current predicament. So I spoke about it today with my counselor, and I ended that long description of me being robbed of the opportunity, at least, to continue enjoying good food in the manner of which I always had. as, and I quote, a bit of a bummer. And yes, indeed, that's a bit of a bummer. So that was a rather long complaining session about my inability to superindulge into heavy, overwhelming meals. Really, that's what that was. And maybe all of you have already signed off, or I don't know, moved on to other better things. So I acknowledge that. That was a long complaint about me not being able to enjoy the same thing in the same way as I had before. Not like that's ever happened to anyone, right? Of course, it's happened to tons of people. It's happened to everyone at some point. But as I tally up those things that seem unattainable through any means anymore, and then the simple but to me important pleasures being more and more unattainable. It definitely pushes me further and further into a corner of despair. And that's something I spoke to my counselor about today, and some other very disturbing topics. Much more disturbing than that is I did not want to change my MO and my enjoyment of delicious foods and the way I do it, because that's a part of me. And in the state that I was in just a few days ago, I was probably not in a very good state of being able to care for my own self. I live alone. Well, with my little doggie, of course. But there's no other humans here. And I was pretty helpless. So I talked to my counselor about that. At what moment will it come and be true that I am no longer in a position to be by myself because of unexpected events such as this. I just know through, I guess, normal expectation that this is something that's not going to get better. It is going to get worse. And one of the things in my life, very similar to my love of food, is a very fierce sense of independence. Oh, I hate living with people. And honestly, I had two relationships in my life in which I lived with my significant other, and one I was full on married. Uh, I am now divorced. Yay. But whenever the move in occurred, things started to change, and the relationships would always get ugly, and eventually, and after the sharing of the same abode and having a roommate, oh my God, I can't even imagine. Maybe I sound like a little brat right now. Actually, I probably do. But you got to understand that my fierce sense of independence is an enormous part of my innate being. And to have that removed from me may very well leave little of me that I continue to like or enjoy. I mean, honestly, I like me. I hope you like you. I don't want to change something as dramatic as that because I could not imagine that leading to anything good for me. And it will get to a point, if it goes that way, which it almost certainly will, it'll get to the point where I don't even know if it's me anymore. And now I'm just hanging on to life for the sake of living. And to me, that is a very deep, disparaging concept. And I don't know for the life of me, literally in this case, how I will overcome that. When I struggle so much with this experience of being able to eat a large meal of a delicious food. Hitchens, again, one of my most favorite authors. Obviously, I refer to him a lot in these podcasts, but Hitchens said the moment of near despair is quite often the moment that precedes courage rather than resignation. And I hope he's right. He would know. He wrote that while he was in his deathbed, dying of throat cancer. He would know what a bad day is. Way better than me, I'd hazard to say. And going even far, way far further back, Hegel wrote, "The owl of Minerva takes flight only at night." For a lot of people, they might not know why I like that quote. You see, Minerva was the Roman goddess of wisdom and battle, but not like the god of war. You had Mars on the Roman side. He was the god of war. Minerva was a goddess of war, yes, but more in the sense of disciplined war. You might go to Mars, the god of war, to seek courage and strength to help you in a battle. Whereas you might also then go to Minerva with great wisdom and knowledge of the arts of war to ask for a better understanding of tactics and maneuvers that could better your chance in battle. That's sort of how I could describe those two Roman gods. But yes, Minerva was also the goddess of wisdom. And her, her, what's the word? Her avatar on Earth was the owl. Ergo, that is why Hegel speaks of the owl of Minerva takes flight only in the darkest night. So he doesn't say sometimes, he says all the time, I guess, but that might be a little bold. What he's trying to say is the wisdom that you seek to get through a difficult situation will only become apparent when it is finally upon you, when it is the darkest moment of the day. Only at dark, only when it seems all is lost will the sight to see a way out will become apparent. And For my sake, I hope that's true. Because right now, I can sort of live with the food thing, but it's just like another pinprick. It's dying from 1,000 paper cuts. You know, it's just one more paper cut, and then the thought of it even getting worse with situations such as the one that arose from a mere meal. The natural progression of that and extrapolation means independence is just a concept anymore, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know how I will one day overcome that. I don't know. I have no answer now because that is such an integral part of what makes me me. And as I said, I like me. I want to be me. Okay? I hope you feel the same way about yourself. Maybe you don't want to have, a disease or, I don't know, a rash. That's not you. I hope you get what I hope my listeners get what I mean when I say I like me. I like what I have created of myself through all these decades. I genuinely do. And to remove one of the most foundational aspects of it, which for me has been fierce independence, I don't know how I will navigate such darkness. And here in this quote by Hegel, he's saying you're not going to know until it's there. I hope he's right. Or at least, if he's wrong, I hope I understand how to overcome that at least beforehand. Not that there simply are no options. So, at this point, I think Hegel's description is the best way to describe where I am now. I don't know how I'm going to overcome things as they get worse because they will get worse. I don't know how I'm going to maintain independence if I can't even send a frickin' text message. But I hope that Hegel is right, that when that time comes, that's when you'll learn those things and you will find out. And I've always thought Hitchens was right that points of desperation often lead to moments of great courage and not despair. I do think that is something that I have experienced in my life again and again and again. So, with that, I'm pretty solid. I think that's true. which is why I know the quote. And with Hegel, man, I hope he's right. I hope he's right, because right now I am stuck. Well, my friends, I think I have beaten this topic to death as much as I can. I know that some of these topics are slower or more exciting than others, depending upon what your individual perception is. But in comparison to some more recent podcasts in which I was literally left with no answer, I was left with, I don't know. At least for me, I think that, well, think's probably the wrong word. I hope that Eagle is right. And there's a lot of reasoning to think, obviously, he is. You don't know how to get from A to B until you know what A and B are, do you? A may just be from the sofa to B, the toilet. That's simple. Go to the Apollo program. It's going from Florida to the moon on the Sea of Tranquility. That's a different A and B. That's going to take a little bit more work. But until you're there, until you know those qualities of those variables, it's fair to say you're not going to know until you get there. And that actually is, in a lot of ways, comforting for me, because at this moment I cannot begin to imagine how to function or be happy while not being independent from others, not having roommates, or, God help us, orderlies and nurses watching over me or something. There may be options that will become available that in this current moment I cannot see. I mean, to be blunt, there are absolutely options that I don't know of now because I cannot imagine it. Because my visibility in this case is very limited. That is my independence. So, at least in some sense, I'm leaving this podcast feeling better than when I entered. I think it's okay to not know how to get there right now. It'd be nice, but it's okay. And it's more than likely not something that will not be apparent until that moment itself arrives. And I hope again that, as Hitchens put it, I will exhibit bravery and fortitude and not despair. If you combine those two components and take them for what they are, written by people who, frankly, knew what they were talking about, um, it seems like I'm in a better position now than I was before I did this podcast. And at least I can perceive what my goal might be, sort of. That is to find the right way to adapt and compromise if I have to. And with the reassurance that it's not of my character to crumble into despair when faced with any sort of calamity or near calamity. I do have the history in my life, at least, to know that I tend to go the other way. And that is, I tend to get courageous as opposed to being paralyzed with despair. So, I hope Hegel is right, at least in this quote. And I can better know how to get from A to B when I know what exactly those variables are. So, in other words, I am leaving this podcast with some reassurance, and some hope that these are circumstances that can too be overcome, and done so in a way that I am not in any sort of position, whereas I have to betray my own sensibilities, my own nature. That's a better word. I do not have to necessarily, hopefully, I do not have to necessarily betray my own nature. And it's not much of a step in the right direction, is it? But it is a step nonetheless. And quite honestly, as it relates to the topic of how in the world I would overcome the enigma of continuing my life in any sort of a happy state while retaining my independence with this disease getting worse. I mean, this hope, at least, is literally my first step in that analysis of that question. Whereas if you asked me at any time in my past, years, days, whatever, in whatever time in my past, if you asked me, how do I plan to handle this? What do I hope to achieve, even? I would say back then, before this podcast, I don't know. But I can now answer that I can only hope at this point that it will be available to me in some form of clarity once that disdainful situation arrives, and that I will be courageous to move forward through it and not crumble under despair. That's a much better answer. Much better first answer, other than I don't know. So, with that, my dear listeners, I think, as I've already said, I've driven this topic well into the soil on this podcast. I hope I in no way overextended your good hospitality to listen to my bizarre ranting thoughts and mind confusions that I spindle out of control as I try to tackle my own psyche. But in all seriousness, thank you for listening. You've already done the most important thing and the greatest thing possible for me by listening and giving me a voice through which I can hopefully overcome these issues. But I'll leave it there and say ciao for now.